Welcome to Global Conversations, Round 3, The View from 30,000 Feet. I am absolutely delighted to have one of our star guests, the writer, broadcaster, producer, Sharon Basco. And Sharon, thank you so much for doing this in the midst of an extraordinarily busy time for you.
I think it's a busy time for everyone, and I'm delighted to be here.
So I first met you on the arts and specifically on the ballet beat in my home patch of Boston, and we were talking to each other about a piece for Boston Ballet's initiative choreographer. But you have a really extraordinarily eclectic and interesting background that moves into science and technology, which is interestingly, we had another interview who also was. So I'd love you to talk a little bit about how that came to be, how you ended up in part in arts, and now you've gone back to a little bit more towards science and technology, and how that informs how you think about stories.
I have always written about dance, starting with my college newspaper. I did an investigative story that sort of launched my career in journalism, in print journalism. But at the same time, I was totally falling in love with dance. At American University, where I was, a brilliant woman called Naomi Prevost ran the dance department and brought in companies who would work with us, who would give us master classes. They would be performing at Wolf Trap and at the Kennedy Center, and she would haul them in, and they were just wonderful. So I got to study in little bits over the years with Twyla Tharp, Paul Taylor, Don Redlick, Merce Cunningham, Jose Limon's company, Martha Graham's people, not Martha Graham, an array of amazing people. And at the same time, because I was writing for the school paper, I could see everything at the Kennedy Center and at Wolf Trap for free, which I would not have been able to afford. After college, I moved to Boston to work in news at a weekly newspaper called the Boston Phoenix, Boston After Dark. And at the same time, I started writing freelance for little newspapers about dance so that I could go, because I could get free tickets and all I had to do was write a review. So that's sort of been my trajectory, that I've had these jobs in journalism and eventually in broadcast. My husband was an editor at the Globe, and so the Globe was not open to me because of nepotism. So I tried to go into public radio. I thought I was pretty hopeless, but was hired as an arts reporter at WBUR, the local station, one of the local stations, and did a terrible, I listened to it some years later, the worst voicing you have ever heard of a review. And I reviewed the Nutcracker with squeaky little voice. They probably thought I was one of the mice.
You probably landed in one of the best possible places. Tell us what you're doing this week, something about reverberating oscillators and drones delivering medical supplies.
Yeah.
And
well, I had actually retired from doing the sci-tech stuff like 4 years ago, so I could travel more. My husband was an editor at the Boston Globe, and we really wanted to travel, and so we did that for a while, and then the pandemic came along. When the pandemic started, I realized that, number one, writing about dance, which I had gone back to when I retired from public radio, that was not going to happen much because there weren't many performances. And so I just asked the folks at Here and Now, the public radio show, and the magazine IEEE Spectrum, whether they wanted to go back to doing radio pieces, and they did. So I am fortunate that I have more to do now during the pandemic. I would not be looking for this if it hadn't happened, that we have to isolate ourselves, and dancers have to dance in their kitchens and their decks and out in meadows and stuff instead of on stages.
so you and I met over I think one of really the seminal pieces of dance journalism that's come along in the last 10 years that you wrote about the lack of women choreographers. But what I had impressed me so much is you know the history. So you pointed out the fact that most of the major ballet companies in the United States were started by women. And I'd love you to talk a little bit about that piece and then where you think the profession is, COVID or not these days, opportunities for women, what might be holding them back, and where you see hope and where you get frustrated.
Well, I can't tell you much about the current scene because I came back to the current scene just a few years ago. And you, Liza, are the one who is looking at and defining and putting together numbers. I think you're the Betty Friedan of this whole movement, because other people, and I noticed even in some of your interviews, the Cincinnati.
Yeah, Victoria Morgan.
Yeah, and the Norwegian National Ballet's Ingrid Lorentz. And they both said to you, I wasn't thinking, I'm surrounded by women, and I wasn't thinking about what you're pointing out. You did that. I mean, you identified the way to move forward. And I congratulate you, because we really needed a Betty Friedan to say, I'm going to put numbers together. I'm going to put the numbers in front of people's eyes, in front of the boards, and they're going to have to responsibly respond to this. I think that's.
Thank you. I mean, I do wish that we would hear more back about the numbers that we're producing, but I think we're just going to keep chipping away at it.
Yeah.
So, talk a little bit about history and how it's important that we recognize it. Frankly, your impetus is one of the things that started our series, Her Story, where we tried to recover the history of just how many women are involved in founding ballets, big and small. So I'm going to toss it back to you as my inspiration.
Well, this funny thing happened, which is I quit writing about dance, I would say in the late 90s. And when I left, what I was most familiar with was the scene that had gone on for like 40 years from the time the Ford Foundation, which I think was in 1963, they just put like less than $8 million, $7.7 million or something, into a vast project of starting ballet companies like Johnny Appleseed, going around the country, finding people who were running wonderful ballet schools and saying, do you want to start a ballet company? We're going to help fund you, and George Balanchine will work with you and give you a few pieces so that your company has some really classy repertoire to start with. Boston Ballet was started because there was a woman called E. Virginia Williams, very brave, wonderful, crazy lady. I mean,
she was nuts. I met her. She was fabulous, but she was really nuts. Just like the woman who started the opera in Boston.
Yeah, right. And she always wore, the opera lady always wore her sweaters, all funny and
yeah, big personality. Oh, why can't we remember? Anyway,
Sarah Caldwell.
Bingo.
Yeah. And anyway, and in Pennsylvania, the person running a great school was Barbara Weisberger. So they gave money to start Philadelphia Ballet. Anyway, there were like 7 or 8 companies that started. All of them, I think, succeeded, except maybe Mary Day's Washington Ballet in Washington, D.C. But that's how Ballet West got started. And at the time, I think there were only 2 companies. One started by the Christensen brothers from Denmark, San Francisco Ballet, and the other Balanchine's company with Lincoln Kirstein's money. And that was it. But this started, and I do think of it as Johnny Appleseed. It started with like this money being given out around the country. We're going to help you start, and you will grow it. So when I left writing about dance, there had been about 40 years of these women the founding women growing their companies. And that's what I was used to. And I went away to public radio. When I retired from public radio, I started writing about dance again. And I looked around and I did not recognize the geography of this art anymore. All those companies that were thriving, doing wonderfully, Boston Ballet had done wonderfully. And that's my home company, but all over the country. I mean, except they were all run by men. And I thought, I have to do a radio piece about the fact that all these women got cheated out of their companies, and now the companies are run by men. So I started out to do this story, and with an open mind, because I was wrong. The women had not been cheated out of their companies. I mean, the women had been a certain age when they started the companies, and the companies were going to get handed off to someone else. And what had happened was a perfectly understandable thing. It's the boys who have to be, the little boys have to be encouraged to stay in ballet classes. You need the boys for ballet companies. So they're given every kind of encouragement, choreograph for the spring audition. We're going to give you free tuition to stay in school. The boys are encouraged in every way because you need them there. And these are boys who are athletic and they're choosing not to go out on the soccer field. So they, they're being brave to stay anyway. So there was nothing nefarious about it at all. It was just totally understandable how these boys who had been given opportunities rose to become the administrators and artistic directors of these companies. So that's the piece I did back in like 2015. And part of that I did write about, though, was that the guys were not using choreography by females. Because the women in the company, very, very busy, a lot busier than the men in the company, and the men realized this. They don't have time to choreograph. They're not, and they weren't being given time to choreograph. So anyway, that's what I wrote about, that this kind of natural thing had happened, but we were in this situation now where almost all the work that you were seeing on stage was by men, choreographed by men. And it took a Betty Friedan to come along and say, I'm going to do something about this. And I know that you had a lot to do with starting the choreographer program at Boston Ballet.
So either assuming we're in the before times or that we do eventually get out of this or not, talk to me a little bit about what structural reforms you think there might be that will make ballet more equitable, inclusive, open to new voices, new ways of looking at things, and also, frankly, fun and intriguing and interesting art, because really that's what we're there for.
I don't know if it really addresses diversity, but I did a series in the mid-90s after the Berlin Wall came down, going to some cities in Europe, Warsaw, Budapest, Berlin, and Prague, where they had been under Soviet domination, meaning that the Soviets had paid hugely to keep the arts at a very, very high level in those places as propaganda tools.
Sure.
Once the Berlin Wall came down in November of '89, all of that started to crumble because the Soviet Union was no longer this great, rich entity that was able to throw money into athletics and arts and whatever else just for propaganda purposes. And my series going to these places was about how arts organizations were going to survive the lack of state funding. Because suddenly, and they weren't used to collecting money from angels, from contributors. Ticket prices, I don't know what percentage, but I think it was rather low of the income that they would derive from ticket prices. But what they did throughout Europe, and you know this, but I'll tell you anyway, was from the earliest age, school children get tickets every semester, one ticket for theater, ticket for opera, and a ticket for ballet. And so twice a year, they're being exposed to these great companies. Some of them, I mean, the companies in I think it was Prague, my sound engineer and I went to, I think it was the 5th company, like not the first company, not the second company, but because we wanted to be at a performance for little kids. And the girls came in with these big white bows and their mommies and daddies, and they behaved and they watched the magic flute. And the magic flute, when the queen of the night came in, you really realized, yeah, this is the 5th level company, because she was brought in on a ladder, on top of a ladder, and the ladder was, and she was, doing her, and the ladder was just going crazy, and the kids were just finding this the best thing of all. And she part. And but she was a good singer, but it was a production that probably needed some work and a lot of oil on the ladder.
Oh my gosh.
But anyway, they build their audiences. That's what I'm finally getting to. They build their audiences from the time the kids are little. And I think, and so you learn to love these productions. It brings back memories, and it just is part of your education. And I think if we could do that in the US, we would never have trouble funding the arts. We wouldn't have to find sponsors all the time. We would actually have people, breaking down the doors to see traditional and conventional and experimental production of everything. I don't think I answered your question, but.
Yeah, to that point, I remember going in to see American Ballet Theater, which I'd seen 4 or 5 times already. But it was, I think, a matinee. So it was probably a Sunday matinee. And Misty Copeland was performing. This is probably 3 or 4 years ago. And as far as the eye could see, there were crowds waiting outside, I think, hoping to get a glimpse of her. And it was a Chicago I'd never seen before. These beautifully turned out as if they were going to church, middle class, upper middle class, African-American families with their daughters, again, with the white bow, perfectly turned out. And it was like being in a rock concert. It was the most exciting thing I'd been to in years. Just the overwhelming love coming at the stage, and, Misty acknowledging it, and just the sheer excitement. It wasn't just another performance. It was a recognition of a bonding. It was amazing. And that is why I think so much that having more diverse performers on the stage, as well as, of course, different voices, different visions, really is going to be necessary to keep the art form going. Because to your excellent point, the audience is there. It's absolutely there, I believe, waiting to be spoken to. So let's finish up with arts journalism in general. When I was growing up, there were probably 3 or 4 newspapers in any major town. That is changing nowadays. And I was having a conversation with somebody who said, well, that's going to go into dance blogs. The problem is we're not, it seems to me, and this may be true generally, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, having a shared conversation, because we're not all opening the paper and seeing the same thing on a Sunday morning. Can you talk a little bit more about the state of journalism generally and arts journalism in particular?
It's a really sad story. It's a really sad story because, as you know, the jobs for reporters are not there anymore because of lots of things, the internet. But small newspapers died, and then large newspapers couldn't figure out a model to make money selling their papers on the internet. No one had the experience to, they have it today.
Yep.
But to start out by saying, no, you can't have the Wall Street Journal unless you pay a fee. And people would have gotten used to it. That you didn't get a magazine unless you paid a fee. You didn't, you know. So they offered everything for free. Closed a lot of newspapers, and the first reporters always to go are the arts reporters. So I think any newspaper you go to, the arts reporters are pretty much gone. And they're off blogging somewhere, or, you know, trying to earn a living as freelancers, but there's really no one to freelance for that where you could earn a living. But I mean, arts writers are still there, critics are still there, but there aren't very many publications that actually pay people to do that kind of journalism anymore.
Well, that apparently is the case. That would be my next project. Let's look at something different. You get to pick. It's something that was virtual, or the last thing that you saw live that just rocked your socks. And I'll give you mine, which was Akram Khan's Giselle.
The thing that comes to mind is one of the first things we all saw at the beginning of the pandemic, when someone put together an 8 or 9 minute video of ballerinas all around the world dancing. I don't know what section of Swan Lake it was. And do you remember that? I'm sure you saw it. Everyone, it was before there were so many things to see. And it just built in power as you saw one ballerina after another, a ballerina in Australia, and she would do 6 measures, and then a ballerina in Berlin, and ballerina in Seattle, and, you know, just all over Mexico City. And by the end of that thing, I was just blubber. To think of all, and it just for me put together all the talent that was right now totally under a rock.
Isabel is letting me know, by the way, this marvelous chat function, Missy Copeland again, that Missy Copeland organized the Dying Swan, and it was Swans for Relief.
Oh,
So God bless Misty again. Sharon Basco, multi-talented person in so many different fields. Thank you so much for your time. I know you just keep getting busier. Everybody's calling you. So thank you for taking the time with us.
Thank you very much. I'm so delighted to be here, but I do have to say, Liza, you are the Betty Friedan, and keep going and keep telling everybody, open your eyes, because you have a perspective that is just, you're smashing through the boundaries. I think
Can I call you when I get tired and discouraged?
Please, and we can sing some songs from Broadway musicals and cheer us.
Excellent. Excellent. I'm a big Gilbert and Sullivan person. Well, thank you so much.